Hi, I'm Karl Smith, Head of Research Excellence at the University of East London and your host today. In the Science Out East podcast, we explore different science projects happening in East London. In this episode on how a DJ or a party might just save your life, I am joined by Professor Tim Lawrence, author of 3 books that trace the history of DJ, music, dance and art culture in New York City during the 1970s and early 1980s. But Tim is also a contributor to nighttime culture himself. How? Well, he organizes parties and more. But Tim, why don't you introduce yourself for our listeners?
Karl, I think you just have introduced me very nicely, but thank you for the generous introduction. Yes, I mean, the books I've been writing cover New York City in the 1970s and early 1980s. I didn't expect to be drawn to that period. I thought I was going to be writing or researching the period that was focused around electronic music and house music. But the 70s became very fascinating to me and really came across as this very creative and very communitarian period. And just to kind of make the connection with the parties that I've been organizing for 20 years now. The key figure, the visionary pioneer of arguably DJ culture really in New York City, a guy called David Mancuso, who passed away at the end of 2016. Back in 2003, approached me and asked me if I wanted to start organizing parties with him in London, and a few others joined us as well, of course. And we started a party that was inspired by David Mancuso's party, which was a party that still runs called The Loft. And we started Lucky Cloud Sound System in 2003. That's still running. And in 2018, I started another party called All Our Friends. And they're based on these fundamental principles that David effectively put into action in this kind of key party he started in early 1970, February 1970. And that's to have a very inclusive and communitarian way of organizing what you do, and to also put a very high emphasis on the quality of the sound system and the reproduction of music.
Fantastic. And Tim, I just want to go back one step then. So what came first? Was it your involvement in the parties, or was it the research? Because you mentioned you had this interest in electronic research. So how did it all begin for you?
Sure. It all became intertwined, really. I've always been drawn to danceable music. My parents died quite quick succession when I was a student at Manchester University. And I found myself relatively soon afterwards turning to the dance floor for solace and a sense of hope and a sense of community. I was pretty low at the time. And I became very passionate about, I did feel like the dance floor saved my life at that particular moment. I was a journalist at the time working at BBC Newsnight. I wasn't finding journalism quite as engaging as I hoped. I started to read books by Edward Said, a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University and also a Palestinian activist, and the music I was listening to, which was mainly house music coming out of New York, led me to decide to go and live in New York City to do a doctorate in comparative literature, get to study hopefully with Edward Said, who had this model of being, let's say, a public intellectual. He had just done a Reith lecture series on that, and that kind of gave me the idea that, yes, you can be a researcher, but you can be outward facing rather than just kind of inward looking with the academy. And I can simultaneously immerse myself in house music culture, which, you know, I'd become basically addicted to be honest. I was spending a ridiculous amount of money each week on records. Early into this period in New York City, a kindly professor turned to me, a sort of mentor figure, and said, why don't you write a history of electronic dance music culture? Because, you know, this was 1994, more or less, 95. The John Major government had effectively tried to criminalize rave culture in the United Kingdom. So I thought, great idea. Early into my research, the guy called Stephen Prescott, who was running the record store where I was going shopping every Friday night, said, why don't you speak to this guy, David Mancuso? He was around somewhere at the beginning. And initially I was somewhat reluctant. I was open to different ways of researching what was going on, but I didn't really want to go to the 70s at all. I was into electronic music. I associated the 70s with, let's call it, cheesy disco. And I kind of arranged to do this interview just out of a sense of duty to look into what the background might have been to the story I really wanted to write. And I met David Mancuso, and we had a 3-hour interview, and it was captivating. He came across as a mixture between a biblical prophet and a sort of teddy bear, basically. But he was a genuine visionary. By this point in his life, he was pretty down and out, but he was definitely the most compelling person I had spoken to in terms of the research I'd already conducted. And he remains to this day the most interesting person in a way I've managed to interview. And he just had this vision. And the vision was that the dance floor is a place that can attempt to resemble a utopia. Up until this point, dancing was largely considered and even experienced as a space of hedonism, as a space of even escape. Just, having a good time, forgetting about the rest of the world, etc. For David, it was very much an intentional experiment almost, but it was a practice really, in which you try to see if you can create a perfect environment of freedom. Of course, David had come out of the countercultural movement of the late 1960s. He was very involved with civil rights, the anti-war movement, also gay liberation. So, one of the things I say about what he introduced at the Loft, which is what his party came to be known as, and it's important to emphasize it was actually a house party. It was a party in his home. It wasn't open to the public. It wasn't advertised. It didn't have to meet New York's restrictive cabaret licensing laws. So what he wanted to create in his home was a form of utopia where you could create a perfect environment of freedom, the kind of freedom that was being experienced or being pursued in the late 1960s, put into practice in someone's front room. And just to make a passing comment, really, even though David passed away in November 2016, the Loft, this party started in February 1970, is still running today. The community roots, the practices that have been embedded, the devotion of people who go to this party, and the way it continues to offer people hope in a world that arguably has become more individualistic, more competitive, where useless wars continue to rage, this becomes an important thing for people to commit to. And, my own involvement is to say, right, history's about this and the wider scene, and let's also try and see if we can continue to put these ideas into practice.
Thank you, Tim. I think David Mancuso, from what you said, he really articulated very clearly the principles of the perfect house party. But can you just elaborate a bit more? What were those key principles?
Well, the principles were that the party is effectively run as a non-profit enterprise. It's anti-exploitation. If someone can't afford to get in, then they can write an IOU note, because at some point, hopefully, they'll be able to pay back. The party is open to everybody. It's a celebration of humanity, if you like. David got quite upset when, for example, towards the end of the 70s and particularly in the early 80s, the Paradise Garage, which was maybe still is the most famous kind of party in New York City's history, started to create a straight night and a gay night. And I'm not trying to take a position here about whether that's a good or bad thing, let's say, to have a gay night, because if queer people want to dance together, that's legitimate. But David's view was, we are all human beings and we are at our most expressive and happiest when we party together. David once said to me, imagine a moment where everyone in the world is simultaneously singing a love song. You can say it's naive, but it's also very beautiful. We are all humans. I mean, some of these insights David gleaned, I think, through growing up in a children's home from 2 days old and being looked after by a nun who put on parties, but also from experiencing LSD, some of the acid experience, a psychedelic experience, which is pretty much becoming mainstream these days in some respects and is being seen to have great medical potentiality. Offers some of the insights into the fundamental equality of everybody on the planet, not just humans, but every living form. So equality was very important. And then and it was really about, so everyone was welcome. At one point I was trying to say to David, so was your party primarily black gay men? Because that's what I'd heard. And of course there were significant numbers of black gay men going to the Loft in particular in its early years. But David got very upset about this. He was like, nobody was checking your identity at the door. And part of the thing was that once you're in that mix, that social mix, and you are dancing and you are managing to basically park your ego somewhat because you're just involved in the music and the intertwining of bodies and human beings in this kind of, beautiful motion, you're not really thinking of yourselves in these what we could call conventional societal terms, which are somewhat imposed upon us as categories. And I'm not saying these categories are not important, but we can also be liberated from them and feel a sense of freedom. So everybody was welcome. And then the other principles were that people behave respectfully to each other, and that in order to generate this sense of goodwill and open communication and a relaxed environment, David put the highest emphasis on perfecting his sound system. And the principle there was that music can enhance our life energy. There's a psychologist / semi-philosopher called John Diamond, who later in the early 80s wrote a book called The Life Energy of Music. And David believed in this principle, that music can enhance our energy. David once said to me that he thinks that music is the only perfect thing there can be. And I won't get distracted in trying to explain what I think of that, but it's an interesting statement. So David wanted to create a sound system that was not about the sound system, but it was about being able to hear the music as the recording artists, the musicians intended in its purest form. And this could elevate the party. And the other principle, it was privacy and intimacy and safety and freedom. And if you go to a club, you would be constrained by New York City cabaret licensing laws that would have at the time required you to close at 3:30 in the morning. David didn't want constriction. He wanted freedom. So you have a party in your own home. By law, you're allowed to carry on as long as you like. This was very important to allowing the party to unfold according to a natural flow. David would also make sure that the sound system was played at a level of usually about 100 dB. Which clubs normally play at 120 dB. In a club, you can't have a conversation on the dance floor. At the loft, you could have a conversation on the dance floor without raising your voice. But at the same time, you would still feel the music very forcefully, because this is one of the tricks that a high quality sound system will play on you.
So, Tim, you mentioned something I think which is very pivotal, which is that David Mancuso grew up in an orphanage. Could you talk more, please, about what was the personal inspirations for David Mancuso's loft parties?
Great question. So definitely the orphanage had a formative influence on David and his view of the world. I mean, the first thing is that his own life was saved by a kindly nun, and also the system that kind of gave him a home when his mother decided after 2 days she couldn't look after him. Soon after David arrived in this orphanage, a nun called Sister Alicia arrived and saw that the kids under her care weren't very happy, and so became the first nun in this orphanage to start putting on regular parties for the kids just to give them a sense of joy. Every kid who had a birthday would have a special party, she'd blow up balloons, there'd be music, and this effectively was the formative model of what the loft would become. Everyone is welcome. Many people who go are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, but together they have a sense of hope, a sense of connection, a sense of joy. And this stayed with David, and it clearly, in many ways, David grew up to repeat what Sister Alicia was doing in his own parties. I think it's also worth saying that when David turned 18, he went to live in New York City pretty much the next day. And very quickly, he arrived with $2 in his pocket. He had nothing, and he had effectively stopped his education more or less at the age of 16. But he was an open-minded, big-hearted person, and he found his way to get some odd jobs to stay alive. And very quickly, he realized that he didn't like the discotheque scene that had started to take root in the city, because it was a bit commercial, it was a bit impersonal, and above all, it was transient. But what he did like is what was called the rent party scene, which was primarily based in Harlem, but was taking place all over the city. And these were parties that people would put on in their own home, historically, because they couldn't afford to pay the rent, and they would ask for a small contribution at the door. Now, this culture, very interestingly, goes back to the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. Langston Hughes, the poet, was a big figure in this scene, and it again came about because the African-American community, which had only recently migrated from the rural South to the industrial North in search of work, found themselves to be exploited by absentee landlords, and so started to put on these rent parties. in which, in order to pay the rent, they would ask for a small contribution at the door. And these became a huge part of the Harlem Renaissance and some of the dances that became jazz-oriented dances that became established in that era. And they survived up through to the point when David arrived in New York City. We spoke about this often in interviews. David absolutely loved the intimacy of these spaces. They felt safe. They felt cozy. You could get to know people. Friendships could be made and developed. And there'd be a little record player in the corner, and the host might put on a few records and there would be some food. So again, this became the key reference point for David when he started to put on his own parties in his own home. They were effectively a rent party. The only difference was David didn't particularly need the rent. He didn't need the contribution to pay the rent. The contribution paid for the party to take place, the food, etc. But yes, the rent party and this idea of developing an intimate community was absolutely fundamental to David and the Loft.
We've spoken a lot about David Mancuso, and he was almost a shamanic figure, wasn't he? And this deeply charismatic figure, and clearly very influential. But you talked a lot about his approach to playing records. So can you talk to us more about how the role of the DJ has changed under David's kind of umbrella or ethos?
This is a huge topic, really. I mean, the DJing has changed in many ways. I mean, this is a subject of, books and books. But what started to happen pretty soon after David started his parties is that there was more and more emphasis on kind of mixing. And after a short while, there was more and more emphasis on the DJ as a kind of what we could have almost called a substitute rock star. One of the things that David kind of was very interested in the party, another principle, if you like, is the DJ should be on the same level as the dancers and should almost be obscure. So, and I learned this very well when David came over to London and we looked at venues. You would walk into a room and David would say, okay, where are you going to put the speakers? Where are you going to put the DJ booth? And his point always was, I grew to learn very quickly, that you walk into the room and what you see first is the party space, because that is your experience. And what you come in and you see last is the DJ booth, because the point of the experience is the dance floor. It's not the DJ. The idea was to get away from the ego of the performer who you worship, which is kind of, let's say, what had come to dominate rock culture. And this is not a criticism per se of rock culture, but you had the performer on the stage and the audience in a more passive role who would cheer on, but wouldn't necessarily be participants. Whereas dance floor culture was very participatory. But what started to happen in DJ culture is that DJs got more into playing tricks, more into mixing, more into I don't want to really call it showing off, but a form of performativity. Whereas David was much more into being almost anonymous, so that the dance floor could always be the center. David's line was, if everyone is facing the DJ, then basically everyone dancing is facing another dancer's back. And David wanted the dancers to be facing each other and dancing with each other, not basically aligned towards the DJ, like you're at some political rally or whatever. But the wider trend, because these are also societal trends, is we live in an age of celebrity culture and of celebrating the individual and all these things, is that DJ culture became more organized around these principles, and DJ booths would be raised and the DJ would basically become a kind of, like a godlike figure or something, even a pop star. So DJ culture has changed in this way. Of course, today, I don't really follow this, to be honest. It's too upsetting for me. But the big name DJs, as far as I'm aware, can get like a couple of $100,000 for a night's work. But, we see the same in sports. We see the same across the entertainment field, is that it resembles the capitalist, we could call it neoliberal or whatever society we live in, where we are living in a world of ever greater inequality. And those at the top of the economic ladder are getting richer and richer. And those at the bottom of the economic ladder are just about keeping afloat or getting poorer. And culture reflects this as part of the world we live in. And DJ culture reflects this. That's how it is. So DJ culture has gone in this direction. More and more, it's also the case that these very highly paid DJs will be pre-mixing their mixes effectively, and presumably also getting other people to do that work for them. This is what happens in the art scene. The most famous artists get a whole bunch of other people often to actually make the artworks. These are the little underlings basically paid, $15 or $30 an hour, who knows what, pounds, dollars, whatever. So this is happening in DJ culture as well. But at the same time, And I think we see this politically more and more with today's younger generation. I'm 57, so I'm getting on at this point. But there is a re-engagement with a sense that the world we're living in has become unsatisfactorily unequal. The hierarchies are damaging. The political elites are self-serving. And there's a re-engagement with a sense of the idea of community and the sense of democracy and what sometimes we call DIY culture. Yeah, right. we can create our own culture. So there is a mushrooming, a flourishing of more democratic, more communitarian dance spaces, just at the same time as at the very higher echelon of the economic ladder, there's this gross inequality as well. So it's a very open field and it's a contested field.
You painted a really spellbinding account of these transcendental experiences on the dance floor. But nonetheless, why should people at home care about engaging with these spaces?
Well, I don't know if people are not required to do anything, of course. But what I would say is that if you take it from me, the preparing for these parties is a lot of work. And sometimes I question if I can still manage it. Why don't I do something that even earns me a little bit of money, for example, because I'm not particularly rich, etc. And each time we start the setup, which starts at 9:00 on a Saturday morning, and the van is dropped back basically 9:30 the next morning. Each time we start, it's like you are meeting with friends, you are forming a community, you experience a sense of joy. My belief is that indeed there are many ways to experience this form of joy. You might running in a marathon, joining a choir, going to sports, sporting contests. These are all ways that we can experience this key thing, which is collective joy. The sense that we are not isolated individuals and that when we are in others, we experience an elevated sense of being in the world that takes us away from our micro, petty, troubled minds that is, obsessed with micro details that are just basically not enabling us to experience the beauty of life, the thrill of life, the possibility of life. And I think that in these spaces you get that. Personally, I think that dance floors operate in a way that's a bit different to, let's say, the way that marathons operate or the way that a sports stadium operates. But my fundamental belief is that it's about being in collective situations. We do live in a society, it's particularly advanced in the Western world, where everything is privatized, many things are individualized, and everything is about shopping, buying, consuming, and these degrade us as human beings. So the more we can find, it may just be going for a walk in a park on a sunny afternoon and it's full of people playing with whatever, frisbees. This is what makes us tune into the value of our life, makes us appreciate our fellow human beings, and makes us hopefully appreciate the privilege of being alive on this planet. And music is a way to make this a particularly transcendent experience.
And what I hear there so much, it's not just about collective joy, but it's connection.
Exactly.
And that's come across very profoundly. We have now come to the end of our segment. So thank you very much, Professor Tim Lawrence, for joining us and for sharing with us so much of your anecdotes, your stories, your experiences, and your very personal reflections on nighttime culture. And I think you made a really vital contribution to it. So this episode was recorded as part of the University of East London's Year of Science. So visit uel.ac.uk/Year of Science for more information regarding our upcoming events. Our next episode will be exploring a theme which, according to my fantastic producer, Maria, is exploring AI in everyday life. So please do follow us on our different platforms to stay up to date with our episodes. Thank you once again to Professor Tim Lawrence. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl.